A gun shop accuses an ATF inspector of wrongdoing. Plus, Reno May discusses his new lawsuit against the California handgun poster. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and pick up a membership today if you want to support our sober, serious approach to firearms journalism and analysis. Or if you want to get this podcast a day early or even be on the podcast, just go ahead and reach out. We love having members on, do member segment, get to know you guys a little bit better. But this week, we are looking at a new case out of California, a challenge to one of the state's most unique laws, restrictions that they have in place, one that is now starting to spread actually a little bit to other states. New York has adopted some of the same provisions of this law. Maryland has one as well, but the sort of idea for this policy comes from California, where they also still have the most restrictive version of it. And today we have a guest with us who's actually challenging the California handgun roster, is what it's called. It's essentially a list of guns you are allowed to own in California, and everything else you are not. So we have Reno May with us here. You guys may know him from his YouTube channel, but he is also a plaintiff in this new case against this California law. Welcome to the show, Reno. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on. This is a really cool opportunity. I really like your work, and it's kind of cool to be a part of this.
Absolutely. We appreciate you coming on. Can you give people just a little more background about yourself? If they haven't heard of you, you have obviously become fairly popular on YouTube, but there may be people perhaps in the DC square who read our work or listen to this podcast that aren't aware of you.
Yeah. So my name is Reno May. I am a YouTuber based out of the state of California. This kind of all started when I was working at a gun store. We had some slow periods, and there was a lot of changing of laws in the state of California. And rather than field 40 phone calls a day, we decided, hey, let's just do one take real good, put it up on YouTube. That way we can direct people there. The gun store ended up closing in early 2018. And I decided to pick it back up when a lot of laws started changing in 2019, I believe, with how to purchase a firearm. And I figured, I'll just make an update and then just walk away from it. Well, a week later, I was sitting in front of my computer again, and then I did it the next week and the week after that. And it kind of just snowballed into where we are here today, really picking up in 2020 when many people for the first time were wondering, how do I get a gun? And in the state of California, it's just complicated enough to where if you've never had someone teach you about firearms or didn't have someone to ask about it, it might have been a little bit too intimidating to walk into a gun store and say, hey, I don't know anything at all. Help. So I think a lot of people saw value in that. And that's kind of how it all started taking off. It's been cool. Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I actually remember watching some of your very early videos. So I've been following along with your progression here for a while, and been a fan. So, it's clearly something that's engaged with a lot of people. A lot of people like the kinds of videos you make. It's interesting too to hear that story because it sounds very similar to Iraq veteran 8888, who I've done videos on his channel as well. Nice dude. He's actually I believe he's the head of the Georgia chapter for GLA now.
Which is super cool to see.
But yeah, it's sort of similar background as far as like how you started doing YouTube, through a gun shop, trying to explain things to people. And then it's sort of snowballed from there.
Yeah, totally.
That's really cool. And now you're getting involved in this lawsuit. There's that's obviously a fairly unique thing to do. Just like, Iraq veteran 8888 has, Eric has gotten involved in that, as more involved as an activist and working with, an established gun rights group. Now you're also working with one in this case. What made you decide to get involved in that way?
Well, being in the state of California, a lot of people ask, why don't you just leave? And, maybe at some point I will. But in the time being, I wanted to do as much as possible to try to influence the culture. And this is another route to influence the culture by making things easier and more accessible to people. I was really inspired by stuff that Iraq Veteran has been doing with activism, how Military Arms Channel, MAC, has been very active with legislators, and how the team at T-Rex Arms, Isaac and Lucas, have involved themselves in Tennessee. The CRPA is a great organization. They are the reason that we were able to legally acquire magazines during Freedom Week. And I saw that as a great opportunity. I had reached out to some of the lawyers and just interacted with them here and there with Michelle and Associates, who works with the CRPA very closely. So close that Chuck Michelle, from Michelle and Associates, is very high up with the CRPA.
Yes, he's the president.
And,
yes.
Yep. pretty up there. And the CRPA, some of their lawyers reached out to me asking if I was interested in being a plaintiff. And I thought that was awesome. I really am happy to be a part of this and being able to kind of have some skin in the game when it comes to the actual fight and not just talking about stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting that track record you've described there of sort of the gun tubers becoming real world activists. Not just, and not that, obviously commentary is a perfectly legitimate form of activism as well. Not to put down anyone else who's not signing up lawsuits or what have you. But it is interesting to see the evolution of gun tubers into real world activists in a number of different forms, as you mentioned there. The Military Arms Channel has been very vocal in, for instance, NRA reform campaigns or moving to alternatives to the NRA. The gun tuber world has been very vocal in those realms, and not just in sort of supporting causes, but actually getting involved. In them. So I find that's a really interesting evolution of this community. Totally in that way. And so you're a part of that. Now let's talk about the law in particular, what you're challenging here. California has an unsafe, is a law against the sales of unsafe firearms, right?
There's a list of not unsafe for sale handguns, which is part of the Unsafe Handgun Act, I believe, where in the state of California, if you want to purchase a handgun from a dealer, so not private party, and you are not a cop or one of the ever-growing list of law enforcement departments, you can only buy certain handguns. And I want to be very clear. Handguns, revolvers. When I say handguns, I'm talking about semi-auto handguns. Revolvers, the requirements are a little bit different. But in order to have that firearm be a purchasable firearm that is not unsafe for sale, sorry, I use a lot of Italian sign language.
Yes, there's a lot of quotation marks going on for those who are watching on YouTube. But yes.
So if you want to purchase a handgun, the only handguns that you have available to purchase are handguns that existed prior to, I believe, March of 2013. Many of which were prior to 2007. So if you want a Glock, you are limited to a certain specific models of Generation 3 Glocks, not the ones made in the USA, only the ones made overseas, because they're different models and therefore not approved.
And so what are some of the features that they require in order for a handgun to be approved by this list?
So I alluded to that kind of in the 2007 and then 2013 changes. In 2007, I believe, was when they started requiring loaded chamber indicators and magazine disconnects on semi-auto handguns. So when you have a round in the chamber, there's a little flag that pops up with writing on it. There is very specific requirements to be a legal chamber loaded indicator. And it has to say loaded when up with a little red flag. That's how we see it on, I believe, the Smith & Wesson Shield, very common. Some of the SIG 226 and 220 variants. So basically, when there's a round in the chamber, a little flag pops up, making it very clear that there's a round in the chamber. However,
that's interesting. But so it's only that specific kind of loaded chamber indicator? Because obviously a lot of guns have, a cutout where you could see if there's brass in your chamber.
There's specific
something along those
requirements. Yeah. So, on most Glocks, you can see if it's loaded just by kind of peeking in through the side or seeing how the extractor sits. So many firearms do have loaded chamber indicators, but it's not necessarily the right type of loaded chamber indicator.
Maybe I have a 1911 here from Remington, and they have a little a hole that allows you to see into the chamber, see whether or not there's
that would not be acceptable because it is not a little flag that sticks up. I don't have any currently right here with me to grab and show. And then the other feature, the other big one, is the magazine disconnect. So without a magazine inserted into the gun, it won't fire even if there's a round in the chamber, which there's a lot of scenarios. Yeah, there's a lot of scenarios where you could imagine that would be not useful. I imagine many people that have been shooting long enough have shot a gun and the magazine unseats itself or maybe wasn't seated properly. And that could stop you from being able to pull that trigger when you need to. Those are the two features that I believe they added in 2007. Then in 2013,
this is a much more controversial feature.
Yeah, this one is the one that made it impossible, or nearly impossible to comply with, when they required microstamping. And microstamping is, in essence, they wanted the semi-auto handgun to imprint on the spent casing in two locations a identifiable marking to that gun that could be traced back to the original purchaser of that firearm. It's now been reduced to only one location. Unfortunately, the technology does not exist on any currently purchasable production firearm. So that's why we're stuck with Generation 3 Glocks, because they're not going to add a loaded chamber indicator or a magazine disconnect. And the technology for microstamping does not exist practically on the market. There are firearms that have proven that the technology could be a thing, but it is not reasonably possible. Yeah.
This is like the brainchild of a single guy, wasn't it?
Yeah. And I think we've seen some examples where these smart guns or these guns that have the technology they fail. They're just not safe in the sense that they don't function well.
Outside of this, I forget his name, to be honest with you, but there's one person who proposed this concept of imprinting, a QR code basically on every cartridge that was fired from a firearm. And this idea is that you could then trace the casings to specific firearms. I mean, there's a lot of conceptual issues with this idea in the first place. I mean,
and in practicality,
and then in real life, no one has ever produced even a prototype. I mean, this guy made his own model to demonstrate that it would imprint something onto a cartridge, which is not. If you ever fired a gun, you looked at the primer. It, of course, it has an indentation from the firing pin, and so in theory, the theory is if you put some sort of QR code on there, it would leave an indentation. But I mean, I think anyone who understands how primers work and how soft they are would understand why that's not really a super reliable concept. And
it's
there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of debate over it.
Yeah, and in practicality,
now I will say.
I'm sorry. Anyone can just take a small little file to it. It could get damaged over time. If someone wanted to commit a crime and take someone's brass that had that microstamped brass and scatter it around, if the firearm was stolen, if the firearm has changed hands in any way from the original registered owner of it, it doesn't do much. It's the same thing as any stolen firearm that has the serial numbers removed. If they're going to leave the gun at the scene of the crime and they know they're going to potentially or be in possession of a stolen firearm, they're probably not going to want that traceable information trackable back to them, and they could easily remove it and defeat this technology.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of critiques of this concept, but California has deemed it viable, which is why this requirement went into place. And not a single handgun has been approved for new handgun model has been approved for sale in California since they did that, correct?
Correct. There are the bolt action repeater firearms from Franklin Armory, the AR pistols that made it onto the roster, but those are exempt from that because they're not a semi-auto. So the requirements are different.
Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, I think another tell with that, the whole debate over microstamping is that nobody produces a gun that can do this anywhere in the world, including countries which don't allow civilian gun ownership and presumably would have a greater desire to try and implement this sort of technology if it were feasible, but nobody does anyway.
Yeah.
So
there's no commercial demand for it. And because of that, there is no commercial supply for it.
Yeah. This is, like you mentioned earlier, it's very similar to the smart gun trend, which is not implicated by this law, but is another area where people debate these sorts of technologies and why they aren't currently available on the market. Because obviously what you'll hear from supporters of the microstamping requirements are effectively that the industry has banded together to not produce these because they don't want people to be able to track fired brass or what have you.
Yeah.
That it's really an industry constraint and not a technical constraint. What do you think about that argument?
I think that if the technology was more available, we would see more companies that are in favor of this legislation producing it. The technology is very expensive to design a specific model solely for the California market. And we are a big part of the firearms market. You know, there's a low percentage of people relative to other states in California that like guns and are interested in firearms, but there's a lot of us. So even that small percentage does have a big buying power. So if the technology was wanted, people would make it. And if it was feasible from a economic standpoint to make it, they would make it. And the technology is not easy to implement in the first place. So I don't see the demand. I think the supply would be very difficult for them to do, and it would be undesirable from pretty much anyone that isn't the lawmakers trying to push this to get it to actually happen.
And as far as the other argument for the roster goes, which is that it's furthering California's interest in keeping unsafe handguns out of public circulation. What do you say to that?
I think that if they actually cared about unsafe handguns being restricted and not being on the market, that argument falls apart when you think about the fact that any handgun on the not unsafe for sale roster is by definition an unsafe handgun, because the Glock Gen 3s don't have loaded chamber indicators per the state definition. They don't have a magazine disconnect. They don't have microstamping, but those are still certainly available to purchase. And the off-roster firearms that are considered unsafe for sale can be purchased by law enforcement. Specifically, I believe the LAPD is now switching over to the FN 509 very recently, a firearm that's very popular in any other state and is, per the state of California's definitions, an unsafe handgun. So they seem to, their argument that they want to keep unsafe handguns out of people's hands falls apart when you look at what they allow to be sold currently and who they allow to buy these unsafe handguns. Yeah.
I mean, I certainly think the police exception kind of undercuts the whole idea. Very similar to this argument about weapons of war that we've all heard repeatedly, because all of the assault weapons bans that have been proposed also have exceptions for law enforcement, which if these are weapons of war, it's quite odd to.
Who are they at war with?
Yeah, equip them for law enforcement officers. But
and why does the horse racing board of California, why do they need unsafe handguns? You know, they were recently added to the list. There's a ever-growing list of departments that I'm confused as far as what law enforcement activities they're doing in the first place and why they specifically need to access unsafe handguns.
But so obviously these are not new arguments. Certainly these have been critiqued since the law was passed. And this law has been challenged twice before and upheld by the California Supreme Court and the Ninth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals.
Yep.
What makes you guys believe that you're going to have a better shot at getting it tossed out this time around?
Yeah, I believe the Firearms Policy Coalition now currently has a case challenging this same law, and that's awesome. I think that's Rena versus Becerra, Renna. And then I think it was, I can't remember the court case that failed and is just dead at this point. We see it as a potential to win in the new era of Bruen. Heller should have been enough, but the state and the Ninth Circuit was totally fine using the means end argument, saying, hey, basically, they want to get rid of these guns because they want it to be safer in California. They were basically able to justify any infringement because the goal, in their words, was to create a safer environment, essentially. With Bruen, now, I'm not sure anyone can argue that there is a text, history, and tradition of banning the quintessential defensive firearms that are used for lawful purposes. There is not much of a history banning the most common, normal firearms in America. And I think Bruen really opens that up. And I'm very hopeful. I've spoken with some of the lawyers, and they are trying their hardest to prepare for the counter arguments, however weak they are going to be. They have to prepare for those, but we see this as very, very high chances of being successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly Bruen changes the landscape quite a bit on this question of whether or not the law violates the Second Amendment. And it will likely come down to this historical analog test that was set up in Bruen. It is hard to imagine that there will be a historical analog to something like the unsafe handgun roster. And so, boy, I do think you guys have a better chance. However, there was, a recent ruling from a federal district court in California dealing with San Jose's gun insurance requirements, which found that law, even though it is literally the first of its kind, it just passed. Was it this year or was it 2021?
I think it was this year, just a couple months ago. Yeah.
I think you're right. It was earlier.
I think they've been talking about it for, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, COVID's still got me kind of. Time is
it's 2020.
Still a strange concept after the pandemic, but yeah, it's still 2020 basically. It's always going to be 2020.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's recently passed. There hasn't been any sort of you need to buy insurance, especially some sort of odd liability against criminal action insurance that they've created in San Jose. There's a lot of problems with this law, but the federal judge who's just reviewed it, the first rung of the federal court system, has determined that there is a historical analog, and it's surety laws that dealt with someone putting up basically a surety against carrying their guns in public if they had been accused of being a threat to society. So they had to put up a surety if they were wanted to carry in case they caused some sort of harm. And so I think that's the kind of historical analysis that you're going to see from judges who want to uphold these kinds of laws. How do you guys plan to deal with it? I mean, obviously you're not the lawyer.
I'm not a lawyer.
You're just one of the plaintiffs, but I'm interested in your point of view on how you counter those sorts of arguments.
Yeah, I believe that was the court case brought up by NAGR that was seeking a preliminary injunction against it, and that was denied. So I'm very interested to see how that plays out, especially since, as far as I'm aware, the specifics of how they're going to enforce that and the specifics of what they want from those ordinances, I'm not sure that's all been finalized as of yet. So it's particularly interesting that they were able to get things through that quickly. So I'm very much following that case. I think that's very interesting. San Jose is a population of, I think, like or Santa Clara County it's a pretty big population in the state of California. I think it's like 4 or 5 million people. So it affects a lot of people, and it could set precedents. Like we were talking earlier, things start in California and seem to migrate out. I know that the lawyers that are working on this case are very aware of that, and I'm sure that they have a plan. I'm not too sure of it, and if I was, I would be somewhat hesitant to reveal those plans.
That's fair.
Because I'm sure they got their strategies and practices of how to fight it that they may not want shared until it's time to share that. So I don't have a specific answer on that. However, they seem very confident in their ability to win this case.
Just to summarize real quick, then, obviously the counter argument to your case is going to be that there were, if you look at it from a certain perspective, if you zoom out far enough, there were laws against, that sought to restrict dangerous and unusual weapons. This is something the Supreme Court has talked about as one of the traditions that exist, and I'm sure that's what a lot of this case is. The historical analysis is going to focus on. Do you find that the historical tradition of restricting dangerous and unusual weapons is a good fit with this unsafe handgun law, or what's your view on how this plays with traditional regulation of guns in America?
Yeah, they're certainly going to try to say that the goal of it is to restrict certain types of firearms that are unusual or dangerous. But the guns that they are restricting seem to be no longer the era of Saturday night specials where they were trying to keep guns that would explode or be particularly dangerous to use for the user and not be drop safed. But that's no longer the types of firearms that are being restricted by this. They are essentially restricting the most common handguns in America, flat out, just across the board. And I'm not sure that there has been a law banning the most common firearms used for lawful purposes that would hold and has been upheld.
Right. So the common use for lawful purposes, which was something that they talked about at length in Heller, of course, and repeated in Bruen. That's where you see this law being unconstitutional.
I mean, I think we would both say that all gun laws are unconstitutional, but when we are talking about arguing stuff in the courts, the arguments have to be a little bit more advanced than screaming the text of the Second Amendment. But I think that it's kind of hard to say that the most common handguns in America are dangerous and unusual. And I think that was part of what was argued in Heller, is that the handgun is the quintessential defensive weapon used for lawful purposes. And specifically with this, they are banning the quintessential defensive firearms that are very commonly used across every other state, barring a few that have similar laws that aren't as extreme.
Yeah, and that is another point too. California's version of this law does appear to be the most restrictive, even with the new provisions passed by New York that incorporate microstamping requirements. Most of these other states have much longer lists of, Maryland, for instance, has a roster, but their roster lists out guns that you can't buy and presumes everything else is legal, whereas California does the opposite. And there's only I believe about 800 models listed, and a lot of those are duplicates. Is that right? So
there's 800 models on the roster. I believe only 500 are semi-auto handguns, because revolvers are on the roster as well. And then specifically within that 500, there is color variations of the same firearms that make it on there. So the actual list of models, what we would consider a model, I would consider a green Glock 19 the same essentially as a black Glock 19. The list of models that is available is significantly smaller. And I think the first cases that went up and challenged this, at the time, there was thousands. And then very shortly after that, it went down to the current-ish number of about 800. So they said that because there were plenty of other handguns to choose from, that it was constitutional, because we still had the ability, in theory, to purchase a wide variety of handguns for various purposes. Now the list is getting
Isn't
smaller
there-
and smaller.
And isn't there a provision now that any new gun added to the list, you have to remove 3 old guns, and it's just sort of
Yeah.
no
So
justification,
let's say someone manages to bring a microstamped equipped semi-auto handgun to the market. Let's just say they manage to do it. If that makes it onto the roster, 3 models that are not to the current standard get removed. I'm not aware of the specific process or if the state has a specific process in place for which models get removed. But to me, that doesn't make sense because eventually, I think if we did the math, there's about 500. So we would need a third of that. A company could, in theory, produce a firearm that's capable of passing all the tests and has loaded chamber indicators, magazine disconnect, microstamping. They could produce one gun, make, 120-ish color variations of it, or maybe they just add a slight difference that makes it a different gun on the roster. And then the only handguns that we'd be able to purchase would be some of the revolvers that are still on the list and all of those microstamped equipped firearms.
Right. But I guess it is somewhat moot at this point because, there haven't been new guns added. So
Yeah.
this remove 3 hasn't gone into effect because they just don't add any.
Yeah.
And then, we've reported in the past on, in the recent past, actually, on some models being removed from the list as well over really completely unclear reasons. Was H&K USPs
H&K,
were removed.
Almost all of the H&K USPs were removed, and it's, again, we don't know why. As far as I'm aware, I don't believe it's known specifically, but many people are rumoring. So like I said earlier, we can only get Gen 3 Glocks made in America. If something about how they make that firearm changes in any significant way, and it could be very insignificant in my opinion, it's no longer on the roster. We saw this with the Franklin Armory with these Franklin Armory bolt action pistols that made it on the roster. They were initially selling them with metal 10-round magazines. At some point, there became a supply chain issue, and they wanted to sell them with Magpul mags. Well, that meant they had to get that version with Magpul mags on the roster. So it could be very easy to see that with the HKs, maybe they started sourcing some of the springs differently. Maybe they got different parts from a different country or a different supplier, and that would change its roster status, even though the gun is spec'd identically. If something changes about how they make it or what they source parts or where they source certain parts, it can change whether or not they are approved. Which, doesn't make sense, but that's the best estimate. That's the best guess we have as why the H&Ks got removed.
Yeah, it's just all these factors seem to really undermine the whole idea that this list is about. Even if you're taking the law at face value and assuming it's in good faith, like there's a lot of things they do to remove guns or exclude them that have nothing to do with safety features.
Correct.
Have nothing to do with the magazine disconnect or loaded chamber indicator or even the microstamping. It's just sort of arbitrary. And then obviously they do a lot of things like allow the police to continue to carry these unsafe firearms. And it's just it's hard to look at objectively and not come away with the idea that it doesn't have much of anything to do with the handgun safety, especially if you're trained in firearms. I'm a certified instructor, and you're obviously an experienced shooter, and the features that they want are like
they're not making
really
the gun
necessary.
more or less safe, and it could be very easily argued. And I believe in the initial filings, they mentioned that the loaded chamber indicator does not make a gun more safe because you can't rely on that. It's always the shooter's responsibility to check and ensure whether a gun is loaded or not. And a magazine disconnect.
That's the thing about any manual safety.
Yeah. You can't rely on the physical safeties, and you have to kind of take it that they are arguing these in good faith. But when you try to look at it objectively in good faith, it really falls apart with all the things that you said about why they're removing guns, why they're allowing certain people to purchase them. but not others. And then the features that they're requiring, it's hard to wrap your head around it in their point of view, assuming that they're in good faith, that they're arguing this in good faith.
Right. Right. And speaking of which, why don't we talk a little bit about some of the new gun laws that California has passed in the wake of Bruen? There's been this response among deep blue states like California, New York, and elsewhere, which has seen a whole crop of new gun control laws come up in sort of overnight, basically, that do a lot of fairly extreme things that almost feel like an attempt to thumb the nose at the Supreme Court, or it's almost like they want to have these laws be challenged and struck down. I don't really understand it, but I want to talk. You just give us a little overview of what some of the new laws are now in California.
Yeah, so one of them in specific wasn't a response to Bruen, but it's a specific response to Texas, and they made it very clear that it is a response to the Texas law on abortion bans. And I believe Firearms Policy Coalition actually was opposed that because they said, hey, if this goes through, other states are going to use this to restrict gun rights. And then California did. And in the bill, it's in the penal code now, because this law passed, they specifically mentioned that if Texas gets rid of their law, the California law will also disappear. And that's the law allowing private individuals to sue other private individuals or companies that engage in selling assault weapons and ghost guns as defined in the state legislature.
Yeah, that one's a little weird to me, though, for a couple of reasons. I mean, Texas did that so that they could avoid pre-enforcement, legal or judicial blocks. Yeah. And obviously California's copying that, and FPC was right. And I warned the same thing at the time that the abortion ban passed. But the idea there was to try and circumvent any constitutional protections of for abortion that existed at the time. Obviously, things have changed quite a bit since then. But they were trying to make something illegal that they couldn't just pass a law to make illegal. Whereas California's version is on top of, they already make assault weapons. You can't,
so it's already illegal to do those things.
Yeah. Now, but it does include there's a provision in there about legal fees for lawsuits against gun laws in California. If you lose on any point in your suit, actually, this may affect your suit that you're involved with. The plaintiffs would then have to pay the government defendants for their legal fees, even if they win ultimately the point that they're trying to argue. And are you guys concerned at all about that in practice in this case?
It's definitely something to think about. I haven't spoken with the lawyers specifically on the concern for that. I know the CRPA is big and involved in this, and it's something that they're trying to hush. They're trying to deter people from wanting to challenge anything. And I think that's very interesting, and it's very shady how they're trying to do that. I think that one kind of flew under the radar. I think the first person I heard about that from was Four Boxes Diner on YouTube.
Yes, he wrote a piece for us about it. Actually.
Yeah, that's super
Mark
cool.
Smith, I mean, it's pretty radical. I mean, I think it's something that is more of a First Amendment issue than even a Second Amendment issue. Obviously, they isolate these legal fees to Second Amendment cases, or gun cases, but really, it's more of a First Amendment issue. It's similar to when like Los Angeles and San Francisco tried to bar NRA members from getting city contracts. Like, it's related to guns, but it's really a First Amendment issue. And
they're basically saying you don't have the right to argue against the government, which is kind of crazy.
Yes, I mean, I'd expect that one to not survive very long in this world, but I guess we'll have to see. And it is something that I suppose you guys need to be mindful of. But what else is California doing?
So one of the recent ones was a ban on 3D printed firearms, which was very interesting. It wasn't that 3D printing firearms was legal in any aspect. Prior to this law recently passing, you would have to go through the state to apply for a serial number, insert a massive chunk of metal into the gun to have the serial number put on, and then you could build it for any firearm that was made out of polymer. They recently passed a law banning the use of 3D printing technology to produce a firearm, even if you apply for the serial number and make everything compliant with the assault weapon ban and unsafe handgun ban. So now there is currently no legal route to 3D print a firearm in the state of California, whereas before there was, but if you didn't follow the laws, it was already illegal to make them. So only people that they affected was me and a handful of other people that I know of that have legally 3D printed a firearm in the state of California. That was an interesting one. One bill that they're trying to push through is SB 918, which I'm not sure if that law is quite dead yet, but it seems as if it's losing traction. And that bill would essentially make it, in practice, almost impossible to carry a gun anywhere in public, because it adds a huge list of what would be considered a prohibited place to carry a firearm. And it would add the adjacent sidewalks to many of those places. Some of those places are hospitals, any building that is funded or owned by the government, any park, fitness centers, any restaurant that serves alcohol for consumption on the premises. So not just bars where the primary purpose is to sell alcohol. It would be anywhere that serves alcohol at all. So in practice, you would not be able to carry a gun and walk on the sidewalk in most parts of the city. So they couldn't make the entire state a sensitive area per Bruen, but they're going to make it in practice impossible to carry. Yeah. And that's an interesting one.
That's another New York copycat thing where it's just like, I guess you're trying to get the Supreme Court to take you back to school again. Like, it just seems like
it's a game of I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you. You know, they're asking for it, you know?
Yeah. It's fascinating too, because I thought that they would end up, it's been a bit surprising to me, frankly, because I thought they'd end up going more the route of DC. DC had a total ban on all gun carry. There were no permits. You couldn't do it in any form outside of law enforcement. And then that got struck down as unconstitutional. So they went to a May issue law that was modeled on California and New York and Maryland. And then that got struck down as well in Ren v. DC. And DC decided not to appeal that decision because they were afraid that they would lose if it got to the Supreme Court. And they explicitly said this at the time. The Attorney General Racine here said, we're not going to appeal this because we're worried we'll lose and it'll set a nationwide precedent instead of DC has its own federal circuit. So the rulings there only apply to DC. So they wanted to contain the damage, and they went ahead and passed the shall issue law, which just basically required a lot more training than most laws, 16-hour class with that's specialized for DC that has to be taught by people certified by the police department. And then it expanded how many gun-free zones there were, including permitted events or events that should be permitted. So any large gathering of people, basically. And then it included a special roaming gun-free zone that follows anyone under diplomatic protection in the city around anywhere they go. So you're kind of supposed to, run away from them. In practice, they have to warn you.
You see them in Safeway and you got to run out the back door. Yeah,
basically. And I figured that was the direction that most of these states were going to go after Bruen. But it turns out that they're just going whole hog and saying, kind of screw you, the Supreme Court. We're just going to basically ignore what you said and pass laws that make it practically impossible. It's for people who have permits, it's harder to carry now than before Bruen. And I just don't see the Supreme Court letting that stand. I don't know.
I'm really interested to see how the California laws get affected, especially at the Ninth Circuit, because, the Ninth Circuit, California felt very comfortable appealing to the Ninth and appealing to the Ninth en banc because the Ninth Circuit accepted the means end approach, and everything kind of just, even if you won at the trial courts, even if you won at the district courts, if it made it to the Ninth Circuit, they were just going to kick it down or say it was constitutional. But now we've seen recently with at least Miller and Duncan, they've both been kind of kicked down in various aspects. And I believe Rupp versus Bonta also. So the Ninth Circuit is basically stalling for time. And I believe one of the judges in the Duncan case specifically said that they are delaying the inevitable, something along those lines. And we've seen cases just get kicked back down to Judge Benitez, who in the past ruled on Miller, the assault weapon ban, favorably, and Duncan, the magazine ban, favorably. So it's interesting to see that the Ninth Circuit is now just trying to kick it back as far as they can, delaying the inevitable, essentially. So I'm curious if we're going to end up getting things to the Ninth, and if the state will appeal it to the Supreme Court if it's favorable for us. Obviously, we would love to have national precedents, but I'm very curious to see how that all pans out in the future strategically for the state.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting. Again, what I would expect is that you'd see what you're describing here, which is this tactic of minimization, where lower courts that don't agree with Bruen, like most likely the Ninth Circuit, obviously the full Court of Appeals. Sometimes the panels on the Ninth Circuit go in the pro-gun direction, but yes, the en banc panel, the full court, has never struck down a gun law. So I would expect them to do what you're describing, try to drag these cases out, send them back down. Sending it back down to Benitez to rehear is
especially when he ruled using text, history, and tradition essentially as his rationale. They know they are very aware that they're just delaying the inevitable.
And I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see as applied challenges, or you see a lot more of these this one provision is unconstitutional. You got to rework the law to be slightly different and then go through the whole process again. That's the most logical approach to this in my mind if you're trying to avoid big rulings. But but that's where passing these laws in the first place is a weird development to me. So I don't know honestly, I have no idea what the Ninth Circuit's going to do. Maybe they will just be brazen about it and say, look, gun regulations existed. This is a gun regulation. They're similar. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they're going to be grasping at straws, but I think that they are going to try to find a way to grasp pretty dang hard at those straws.
Yeah. But to finish this off, let's end on maybe a more positive note for California gun owners. There have been a few developments since Bruen that were positive, right? The people are actually getting concealed carry licenses. Is that correct?
Yeah. Even before Bruen, LA County Sheriff's Department, Alex Villanueva, the sheriff, started issuing permits, I believe personally, as a way to get back at the board of directors and the city council. But either way, many people in some of the counties that have been impossible to get CCW permits in light of Bruen have been issuing, which is very cool to see. Specifically in Sonoma County, we've been in practice shall issue since 2018. But now we got a new sheriff, which I'm very happy about. I helped get people aware of the campaign, and the right guy won. I'm very happy with that. And a lot of people since Bruen have been applying all over the state and asking me for advice. And I've been saying as much advice as I could give them. And a lot of people have been getting concealed carry permits, which is awesome. A lot of people have been much more aware of the fact that in some counties, they probably could have had it for the last 4 or 5 years, but it's awesome nonetheless to see more and more people choosing to go through the process to have a legal route to carry a gun.
Although I will say there's one recent downside to that, which is that the state, in a story that we helped break, was leaked all of the concealed carry licensees' information to the public.
Yeah, that was a fun one, sitting on my phone at 9 p.m. on Reddit, and I see, oh, hey, the state put out this cool little website that you can see demographics and how many people have permits, what, data. I'm like, that's pretty cool. And then I see a comment saying, hey, I kind of figured out a way to download everybody's name and address and driver's license number and all their personal identifying information. And I was like, oh, so I pull up my computer, I look, and there's it wasn't an accident. This feature was built in to be used. And the state tried to call it a data breach or a leak or unintentional, but the feature was built and it was put in there to download everybody's information. Thankfully, the information the state had for me was old, and I don't live at that address. Haven't for a while, but I guess if that's a testament to the quality of government work, Yeah. Yeah, pretty outrageous leak of information there, or dump of information.
the state has offered people credit monitoring resources in response to this, but I imagine that's not necessarily a satisfactory response in your mind.
Yeah, and it's interesting how at the press release when they addressed it and said that they're going to be offering credit monitoring services, they were very specific to say that your social security and banking information was safe. So the biggest parts of what you would be concerned about credit-wise were not leaked, but we're going to offer you credit monitoring. I'm more worried about my personal safety and the personal safety of others, specifically law enforcement, judges, and politicians who were included with that, who I believe many of those people are typically never allowed to have their information accessed, and are considered a protected class in some ways. Mm-hmm. But their information was on there too. I had a couple people reach out to me that were DAs who, you know, have ruled on a couple high profile cases or have been involved in some high profile cases with some very violent people. And now their name and address is out there on the internet.
Yeah, it's really shocking how much information was given out. And it wasn't actually just concealed carry permit holders either. Mm-hmm. A lot of other information from the state's dealer record of service database was also included in this leak. So wildly irresponsible handling of data on the part of the Attorney General and others who were responsible for this website, which really was a website. Honestly, is they put it out right after Bruen. It was kind of meant to be a stunt to show you, like, you know, sort of here's all the gun owners in California. But it wasn't supposed to be here's literally all of them and where they live, which is what it turned out to be, which is much worse.
And you know, if I had a nickel for every time that the DOJ has leaked my personal information, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's kind of weird. It's happened twice. I was affected with the firearm safety certificate instructor data breach that was given out, I think 2016 or 2017. Can't remember specifically. So yeah, twice now in my time of owning guns and being involved, I've had my information leaked.
It's completely unacceptable and irresponsible on the part of the state. But I meant to end this on a positive note, but it turned into a negative one.
Honestly, there are a lot of great things going on with the progress that's being made in many of the court cases, specifically with Miller versus Becerra, which is being brought up by Firearms Policy Coalition, and Duncan v. Bonta, which is being brought forward by the CRPA. And I think those challenges on the magazine ban and the assault weapon ban are huge. And I think they're huge for future cases as well, because everybody wants to see the NFA go away, but there's strategy to this, and we got to kind of show that certain firearms and certain things are protected and have that proven in the courts, have precedent so that we can make progress in the future. So I think it's an interesting time to be alive, to be a gun owner. And hopefully a decade from now, we come back and look at this conversation and say, wow, look how things have changed. Just like if you look at the CCW issuance maps across the country, things have changed over the last few decades. So I think we're in a positive direction, even though the other side is trying to make it much more negative.
I think that's a great point and a great place to end. I do agree with you that in the medium term here, you're very likely to see a lot of California's restrictive gun laws struck down in court after the Bruen decision, so long as the Supreme Court actually follows up on its Bruen decision, unlike Heller, which took 14 years. And so there's certainly a lot for California gun owners to look forward to down the line, even if things at this exact moment are less bright. But hey, we really appreciate you coming on. Tell people where they can find more from you.
My Instagram accounts keep getting deleted, but if you look up Reno May, you'll probably find one of them. YouTube at Reno May, youtube.com/Reno May. I got a Twitter, Reno May Guns, and ultimately YouTube is the biggest platform for me. And I'm very happy to have been on this. I've watched your work for a long time now, and this was kind of a very cool experience for me. Very happy to do this interview with you.
Thank you so much. Hey, maybe I can come on your channel sometime. And I think we'd love to have you back on the show at some point in the future as well. Maybe when the case gets a little bit further along and we have some more news to report on it. I'd love to bring you back on. Cool. Yeah,
thank you, man.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined, of course, with Reload founder Steve Gutowski. How are you this week, Steve?
I'm doing all right. Jake, how you doing?
Doing pretty well. You had a pretty big story to go out today as we're filming. I guess there's this viral video going around sort of the online gun community about an ATF agent inside of a gun store in Arizona. Can you give us a little bit of the details about what happened?
Yeah, certainly. This is an ATF inspector, what they call an IOI, an industry operations inspector, and she was performing a review of this Arizona gun store called Black Metal Firearms. Sorry. And during that review, she apparently took pictures of their acquisitions and dispositions book, or all of their acquisitions and dispositions books, A&D books for short, which include basically all the guns they've inventoried and sold, and where they were sold to, who bought them, where the person lives, all this sort of personal information that is required to be kept generally, in the event of there was a trace. If one of the guns they sold ended up in a crime at some point, that's how the ATF traces guns. They go back to the dealer. The ATF itself is not allowed to keep firearms records outside of certain exceptions, beyond the background checks. They can't keep beyond I believe 24 hours, might be 48, but either way, they have to destroy those records. They can't, under federal law, keep a digital searchable database of gun sales. So when a gun is found in a crime, they'll trace the serial number, and they go back to the dealer that sold it and look through their records. And so that's why these books exist. But that gives you some insight into why taking pictures of them, if you're an inspector, and it's claimed that this inspector is doing it on her personal phone, is something concerning to this gun store when they see it happen, and they confront her about it. But she says she's not creating a database, and that she's not going to stop what she was doing. And so instead they filmed her, and eventually, this actually happened in December. And so they waited a little while to release these videos because they were, undergoing this review. But now I guess they felt that, she recommended the revocation of their license, which would, shut down the store. And so they decided to release these videos now. Effectively, it shows her taking pictures of their A&D books, which is very questionable at the very least.
Right.
Under both federal law and state law, doesn't allow the databases. But then there's also perhaps a more specific issue of what ATF inspectors are allowed to make copies of during their inspections for the purpose of cataloging or providing evidence for errors that had been made in the bookkeeping process. That's the whole point of these inspections. And so you're only supposed to, according to both the ATF, which I reached out to, and their handbook on how to conduct inspections, they say you can only take pictures of records that are directly linked to any sort of error that you found. And at least the gun store claims that this, she's just taking pictures of everything they had and only cited them for a few errors, none of which included selling guns to, for instance, somebody who's prohibited from owning them. So these are what the gun store's calling, more clerical errors.
Right. I was going to say, when you reached out to the gun store, you have it in your piece that it did appear to just be minor clerical errors in the fact that someone would be taking pictures of an entire record-keeping process of an entire gun store. Obviously, is going to raise some red flags, particularly in the gun community, who's already a little bit skeptical of, you see this from time to time, where they're very skeptical of ATF claims about not having a registry, because as listeners might know, they're prohibited from having a registry of firearms by federal law. But there's always claims that they're somehow doing it by backdoor means. So naturally, in a situation like this, obviously it's only one gun store, but it's going to raise the hackles of the gun community who thinks that ATF agents are taking full pictures of an entire record keeping process of gun sales.
Yeah. I mean, you can see why people would be concerned about that, especially if it's a wider spread process. Now, I guess the wrinkle here, right, is that a lot of gun stores today will keep these records in digital form, and this store kept them in a paper form. So, if a gun store is being inspected and has digital records, it might be easier for an agent to make a full copy of those than what happened in this case, where she had to sit there and take pictures of everything. But I mean, according to the gun store, at least, and look, the ATF said that they don't comment on ongoing inspections or investigations. So we don't really have the inspector side of this. They also wouldn't confirm the agent's name that the gun store had given us and other media outlets. So we don't have the inspector's side of this story at this point. We have video evidence, and we have what the store said, and we have the ATF's on record responses, but none of them, the ATF was very vague about it. They said, look, effectively, I talked to Eric Longnecker, who's there. I believe he's becoming the new chief of communications over there, because the previous one just moved on to a different job. But either way, he told us that effectively, the ATF's processes for these inspections are public because they were released as part of a Freedom of Information Act request back in 2019. That's why we know that the handbook says you can't make just copies of everything. They have to be related to a specific infraction that you're trying to bring up against an FFL, a federal firearms licensee, a gun dealer. And so it does certainly seem, at the very least, that the evidence points to this inspector going well beyond what she was allowed to do in terms of copying these records. And obviously, the tensions between the industry, not just gun rights activists or gun owners and the ATF, but also the ATF and the gun industry, which tend to have a little bit more of a at least a cordial working relationship than perhaps the ATF has with gun rights activists. But that relationship between the industry and the agency is under strain now. The president, Joe Biden, has implemented a very strict approach towards regulating the industry, a so-called zero tolerance approach, meaning that a lot more dealers are going to have their licenses revoked under what at least the industry and the dealers consider to be minor infractions, which is what you're seeing, in this case. And then so if that's going to be the approach, I think the industry is going to be looking at situations like this where the ATF inspector appears to have violated the ATF's rules, and maybe even the law, perhaps, where that's less clear. But and if there's no punishment for the inspector, I think that's going to cause even more consternation between the industry and the agency, which is this is an important point too. Obviously, that's something that gun control advocates, they probably don't mind that so much, right? I mean, that's what they want. They've been clamoring that the ATF has been too soft on gun dealers and manufacturers for a long time, and so they want this more adversarial relationship. But one of the big problems, according to ATF agents that we've spoken to for other stories in the past, is that the ATF gets a lot of its tips from gun dealers about gun trafficking, things that don't look right to them. Somebody maybe making a straw purchase, but they can't prove it, that sort of thing. Or someone bringing a gun into their store and they get, there's some red flag about about this person or what they're doing. that's how the ATF gets a lot of tips to run investigations on gun trafficking and other sorts of gun crimes. So if the relationship between the industry and the agency is completely torn apart, that's going to actually hurt gun prosecutions and investigations in this country. I mean, I think that's one of the overlooked parts of all of this. We tend to focus a lot more on the politics of it and the industry and its influence in government or whatever, and the agency's attempts to flex its regulatory muscles and whatever. But one of the key points that gets missed a lot is how the industry actually generates tips for the agency to follow up on, because most of these gun dealers are not trying to sell guns under the table or break any laws. Right. And they don't like people who do. So, right. But that relationship to some degree is built on trust. If the ATF is going to be pulling the licenses of every gun dealer it comes into contact with, then those gun dealers are going to want as little contact as possible with that agency.
Right. And that to me is the biggest wrinkle here in this story, I think, as you pointed out, because traditionally, as you said, the industry and gun dealers tend to have a little bit of a better working relationship, at least historically, with the ATF. But there's been a lot of changes at the ATF in recent years. We finally have a new permanent director for the first time in years. So we don't know how that's going to change the relationship. People in the industry reportedly really liked the previous acting director, Marvin Richardson. I guess there was a good working relationship there. So maybe that's a big change. We don't know if the alleged conduct of this inspector was sort of a lone incident going a little bit rogue off ATF protocols, or if this is just a new kind of way that they're training their inspectors to do things. So it'll be interesting to watch how this relationship develops going forward. As you said, Biden's made cracking down on these dealers a major priority for the agency. Now that there's a director that he was able to nominate and get confirmed, is that going to be the way that they approach these gun stores going forward? It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, that's the big question, right? I mean, I think this case is really going to be symbolic of where things go, how this turns out. Is there going to be an investigation? The ATF said that if the licensee reports or complains to the agency, then there'll be an investigation. We'll see if they follow through on that. Obviously, they're calling for one. I don't know if they've made a formal complaint or what that process looks like, but they have a lawyer, and the lawyer, he raised the same concerns that you did there, which is, how widespread is this practice? Is this a common thing, or is this just, and if it is just that one inspector, why is she doing that?
Right. And
was she, did someone else, above her instruct her to take that approach? We don't know, but hopefully we'll get those answers soon. And, of course, we'll keep watching all this to see if more of these cases pop up. Because I think if this is a widespread incident or widespread tactic, if it's a new thing that's being, sent down from above, then we'll probably see more of this. Is how you'll know, and so we'll certainly keep on top of that going forward. And to just give some clarity here on at least we don't have the report that was written up by the inspectors. So we can't know for sure exactly what was all in there, what the errors were, and whether they are as minor as the gun store described them to be. But the owner, Dave Nagel, told me that effectively they had some clerical errors on checking things like, and some of the stuff they didn't seem to agree with the inspector that on, as far as it being a violation. But things like checking out suppressors or silencers to staff in their records, or stuff like selling firearms to people who had active concealed carry licenses, but who had presented them the expired license. So that the person wasn't prohibited, these two sales, that weren't to prohibited people, but they had done the sale based off of the wrong license, or at least the outdated license. And so that was, I think, one of the more serious errors that was involved here. These things, obviously the store thinks that they're minor, they're small issues that they say they corrected before she even finished writing her report. But we don't have the report ourselves, so we can't verify that that's all the only issues that were involved. However, they would be in line with this complaint that the ATF is going completely zero tolerance, meaning if you have any errors, they'll try to pull your license, and they are trying to pull this store's license, this inspectors. So we'll have to see how that all plays out. We'll stay on top of it for sure, and we'll look for other instances of this happening. And if anyone out there has other examples and wants to speak to us, please do reach out. Our contact information is on the website, on thereload.com, which is also where you can go and buy a membership today if you want to get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and stories that you can't find anywhere else. And you want to get this podcast a day early or have the opportunity to appear on the podcast, please, if you're a member already, if you've listened this far into the show, consider reaching out and coming on the show. We love doing our member segments, and we'd love to have you on as well. And hey, if you made it this far, you might enjoy this show and consider going and rating it on your favorite podcasting app, wherever you're listening to this on, or giving it a thumbs up on YouTube or subscribing to us on YouTube. We also put out clips on the show on YouTube if that is of interest to you, so you don't have to sit through the entire hour-long episodes. You can see just the highlights. But that's it for this week. We'll be back again next week.